Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles. The perfect marriage, eh? Yes, that's what I had. Or at least as far as I was concerned, that was indeed the case. My wife Hilly and I had tied the proverbial knot merely 20 years ago. In fact, the 20 years were up in a few weeks' time, the 10th of December, and I can honestly say that I couldn't have changed much to have made our life together much better. We had the odd argument, of course, but the making up was always that much sweeter. That's just the way we were. There had only been one really black period in our marriage, and that was in the second year. We both married young, me 20 and Hilly just 18, and we'd been childhood sweethearts, living just round the corner from one another. My elder brother Bob had married her sister, Pam, the year before, and it just seemed the right thing to do. Our problem was that the other two had produced their first child during the first year, but it seemed that we were unable. We took tests, both of us, even though the doctors told us we were worrying too much and to just let it happen. But the problem was Hilly's parents, or rather her mother, who kept on at us to get on with starting a family. Their family were like that, of course, and besides her sister Pam, Hilly had 3 other sisters. Chan, my mother-in-law, was so desperate for a son in the family, having failed to produce one herself, and of course Bob and Pam's firstborn had been yet another girl. Pressure. The results from the test were pretty inconclusive as it happened. Hilly was okay, and I had a slightly below-level sperm count or something. I never really understood any of it. The doctors assured us that it wasn't too serious, and that all was okay, and to just be patient, and that our first baby would surely make its own mind up when to arrive. We were patient, but that didn't mean it didn't put strain on our marriage. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait too long as it turned out, and during our 3rd year of marriage Hilly produced just as the doctor had promised. Linda, a beautiful little baby in all respects, but yet another girl. It did at least allay our fears whether we could have a child or not, and from then on everything settled down, and our marriage became the perfect arrangement and carried on that way. No doubt because we were more relaxed about it. Hilly soon became pregnant again, and at last Tom was born. Yes, a boy, and the whole family were over the moon with joy. And I don't get the impression that the girl babies were overlooked or less loved in any way, but that first son in the family simply seemed to make everything special. Well, it was me that did it first. I bragged to my big brother, but all he did was smile back at me and tell me to give him time. Well, he got that, and sure enough the following year they had their first son, and bugger me if 8 months later if we didn't have yet another, who we called Mike. Like buses, wasn't it? You wait for an eternity, and then a whole load of them come along at the same time. I suppose because we were 2 brothers and 2 sisters, that we all lived like one big happy family. Even when Hilly's other sisters got married, they just seemed to be drawn in. It was great for the kids, and of course none of us ever lacked for a babysitter when we needed one. As far as I know, the other couples were just as happy as Hilly and I were, simply enjoying the wonder of a simple married life, with loving family around. There were a few other hitches, such as when Bob had his accident at work, and I had to be virtually strapped up alongside him it seemed, as they slowly transfused my blood into him. He got over it, and of course I was none the worse for it, often joking in a brotherly way that we were truly blood brothers now. As we approached our 20th anniversary, we were wondering how to celebrate it. Bob and Pam had celebrated theirs the year before, and everyone had enjoyed getting together so much that we decided to do just about the same thing, and had booked a private room in the local hotel for a big gathering of family and friends. By then Linda was a very pretty girl of 17, a younger and probably even prettier version of her mother, with lustrous dark brown hair, and huge green eyes that caught your attention whenever she looked in your direction. They were built much the same as well, both slender with nice legs and all the other bits and pieces that perhaps a father shouldn't dwell upon too much. She of course had a succession of boyfriends, and the house always seemed to have one or other of them either coming or going, but she had a sensible head on her shoulders, so we just went with the tide. Tom was, I always thought, a bit more like me. Sturdier in build, and it suited him. He loved rugby just as Bob and I had at his age, and at almost 16 he was already a regular choice at fly half for his school first team. And young Mike, the youngest, well, perhaps he was going through a difficult period, and not being as good at sport as Tom, or for that matter as popular as Linda, poor Mike wasn't having the best of years. Nothing serious, you understand. He was very intelligent, probably more so than the other two, and did very well at school. Just acting like a perfectly normal, totally impossible to understand teenager. That day, perhaps I should have been more understanding that day. Perhaps I should have ignored the mess he'd left on the dining table. Perhaps I should have just cleared it up after him. But did I? No. You're not going out till you've cleared up that mess, Mike. I told him firmly. I'll do it later, he replied sulkily. You'll do it now, Mike, I insisted. Why are you always picking on me? He shouted back, losing his temper. I'm not, I spoke abruptly to him. You're a member of this family and you'll abide by our rules the same as the others. Who's going to make me? Mike almost cried, really losing his rag. I am. I got back at him, beginning to lose mine. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say. My father are you, he screamed back. You sure about that? I came to a sudden halt, my next riposte still buried in my throat, shocked at what he'd just said. Sorry, Dad, Mike jumped in with a pained look on his face. Sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to say that. I'll clear it up straight away. With that he looked away from me and scrabbled about on the table, picking up the books and other things that he had left there. Minutes later it was all clear, and he scooted out of the room without saying another word, leaving me in a world of my own, wondering if that world was about to cave in on me. Trouble was, of course, Mike was and had always been so different from the other two, more studious, more serious, but less gregarious than his older siblings. I'd often wondered why he was so different, and had even discussed it with Hilly, but she just shrugged her shoulders and told me that I was imagining it. Was I? Had I been? What on earth had prompted Mike to make that remark? If he just shouted it out in anger and stormed off, then I would have been pissed off with him, but that would have been the end of it. But he'd been so quick to apologize and withdraw the remark. Why was that? What did he know that I didn't? Oh shit. I really didn't want to be thinking the thoughts that were going through my troubled brain at that moment. My first reaction was to rush off and find Hilly and demand to know what she had been up to. But where would that get me? What would I say? I could hardly just go and accuse her of fucking some other guy behind my back. If she had been, then she would simply deny it, and if she hadn't, then how would she ever forgive me for doubting her? Besides, it must have been 16 years or more ago. But did that make any difference? Was it still going on? My stomach was churning, and I felt like being sick, and I still didn't even know if I had anything to worry about. Oh God, what a terrible day that was. Blood groups. That's it, I thought, and without further ado, I went into our study and rooted out the kids' medical files. Linda, Tom and Mike, all O+, which, after my time giving blood to my brother, I knew was the same as me. I felt a wave of relief sweep over me, till it occurred to me that blood groups didn't tell you the whole story. If Mike had been different, then that was one thing. But them all being the same group could have been coincidence, and didn't confirm that he was truly my own son. Oh golly. What to do? DNA? I couldn't believe I was thinking of such a measure, and that I was getting one loose comment from an angry son way out of proportion. I was panicking without due cause. But when that evening at dinner, Mike could not meet my eye throughout the meal, I got worried again. Then when he shot off from the table without a word to anyone, I got really worried. What's wrong with Mike? Asked Hilly, also noticing his strange behavior. No idea, I replied, shrugging my shoulders. You two kids any ideas? They both shook their heads, probably not even having noticed anything odd. Has he been upset about anything? I pressed them, but they just shook their heads. Waiting for the two youngsters to leave the table, I plucked up the courage to question my wife a little. Mike's so different to the other two, Hilly, I started. Any ideas why that could be? Oh, let's not go down that road again, Davy, she answered me, standing up to put the dishes away. He's not that different. Just a little deeper than the other two. End of conversation. Was that deliberate? Or was she genuinely unconcerned about it? I really didn't know. DNA? Why not find out about it? And 20 minutes later, I was Googling it on the internet. An hour later, and my mind was full of facts and figures, but I was honestly not much the wiser. It wasn't until the Monday morning that I found the name of a laboratory that carried out tests. It took me nearly an hour to find it, and no doubt my secretary could have done it in much less. But what excuse do you make to your secretary as to why you need one? Exactly. That's why I chose to do it myself. They could do it. They had no qualms about that. But it was expensive, especially if you wanted the results back as quickly as I did. But I had to know before I risked throwing my marriage away, was Mike my son or not? When I told them that I had 3 children, they suggested that I send in samples of each of them to cross-check along with one of my own. Have you ever tried getting a single hair from your grown-up children? Not easy, I can tell you, and with Mike continuing to avoid me whenever possible, it was the most difficult of all. However, I managed it and sent them off and waited. Now all I had to do was wait to find out if Mike was my son. Over the next week, Mike seemed to settle down again, probably relieved that I hadn't brought the matter of his outburst up with him. We'd almost got to the point when I felt I could have gently broached the subject, but thought it better to wait till I had the results now that I had gone down that route. My wife, of course, continued to be her normal loving self, and nothing else seemed to change in our daily routine. Can't say as it was the most enthusiastic sex we had during those few days, but I didn't refuse it. Just the doubt was eating me up inside, and though I did my best to hide it from Hilly, I simply couldn't have sex with her without wondering who else may have done, during the 20 years of our marriage. We had dinner with my brother and his wife one night, and when he and I were alone at one point, I almost confessed my concerns to them. He and I were very alike in almost every way, so if someone else was Mike's father, then reason dictated that it couldn't be him. My God, why was I even thinking that way? Had I become so paranoid already? However, something stopped me. I didn't have to burden him with my doubts, and after all, I was sure he'd be there for me if the results when they came were not good. I kept my cool. I kept quiet. I kept so quiet that Hilly asked a couple of times whether I was okay. I'm alright, I answered her. Just got a few things on my mind. She looked concerned for a moment, but didn't press me further. The results came. I had them delivered to my office just in case Hilly got there before me and opened the letter. I read it with my hands shaking as I tried to fathom out what it all meant. Was this piece of paper going to signify the end of my marriage? I read it. As far as I could see, Mike's results seemed to be a good match for mine, and I relaxed, even though I still didn't understand it all. You may have guessed by now that medical terms are all mumbo-jumbo to me. In fact, the whole report seemed to be full of good match and close match, so it seemed that it had all been a storm in a teacup. What a damn relief. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, and thanked the heavens that I hadn't mentioned my fears to Hilly. I resolved to make it up to her that evening, maybe take her out to dinner, and afterwards. Reading the covering letter again, which I hadn't taken too much notice of, I saw that the lab wanted me to give them a ring to discuss the results. Just wanted an excuse to make a bit more money out of me, I supposed, and I wondered whether I should bother. Hello, this is Davy Jones here, I said when the phone answered. Dr. Hoskins has asked me to ring him. After giving the woman some references and things, I was eventually put through to the good doctor. Hello, Mr. Jones, he greeted me. Have you had a chance to look at the results we sent you? Yes, I replied confidently. If I understand correctly, then it does seem that my concerns about my son Mike were ungrounded. Yes, indeed, but not quite as straightforward as that, I'm afraid, he hit me with, and the floor seemed to disappear beneath my feet as I waited for him to destroy my world. You mean he's not my son? I mumbled back to him. It's not that, Mr. Jones, he went on. There's less than 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he is not your offspring. I would stake my whole reputation on his being your natural-born son. So Mike is my real son then, was my relieved response. Yes, he is, Mr. Jones. What's the problem then? I carried on uncertainly. What on earth else could be wrong? I was really quite worried by then, because I had read somewhere that DNA testing could also highlight genetic diseases and such like. Was Mike ill? Did one of us have something awful? What was he about to tell me? It's the other 2 samples you sent in, the doctor informed me heavily. The ones from your son's brother and sister? Yes, what about them? I replied, beginning to panic. Is there something wrong with one of them? Well, it would appear that they are only half-siblings to your youngest son, Mr. Jones. Half-siblings? I stuttered at him. What on earth does that mean, doctor? What's a half-sibling? It means, Mr. Jones, he continued, that it is highly unlikely that you are their real father. I dropped the phone, and the next thing I remembered was coming to with a group of my work colleagues around me. Give him some air. I heard someone call out, as I slowly came round fighting for my breath. You okay, Davy? Asked another voice, and I nodded my head, trying to stand back up. They helped me, and I found myself sitting in my chair, people mumbling behind my back about how hot it was in the office, and what strain they were all under due to the workload. What a load of nonsense. If only they knew. They got someone to run me home, telling me to take the rest of the day off. I was grateful that when I got there, that the house was empty, Hilly being out at her part-time job, and the kids at school. I had to do it. I dreaded doing it, but I had to. With trembling fingers, I redialed the number of the laboratory, and within moments I was speaking again to the doctor, apologizing for cutting the line earlier. Sorry, Mr. Jones, he said. I should have given you a bit more warning, but all we operate is a postal service, and it's sometimes very difficult. I told him I understood, that I was okay, and he went over the test results with me again. Mike was undoubtedly mine. Linda and Tom were very unlikely to have been my children. But the results said all the matches were good or close, doctor. I pleaded. Could there be some mistake? If we'd had only other one sample, he explained carefully. We may well have asked for another sample to verify, but with 2 samples, it's almost 100% sure. The 2 of them are full brother and sister, but I'm afraid it's unlikely that you're their father. But you said they were close, I reiterated, desperately hanging on to the slimmest thread of hope. What does that mean? Do you have a twin, Mr. Jones? He cautiously probed. Or maybe a brother? My brother, I exclaimed excitedly. What the hell's he got to do with it? You must draw your own conclusions, Mr. Jones, the doctor droned on. If you could get us a sample from your brother, then we could do some verification. But I was no longer listening. My perfect little world had indeed come to an abrupt end. What to do about it? Did I want to end my marriage? Did I want to end my lifetime relationship with my only brother? You can change your wife, but you sure as hell can't change your brother. Would it just be better to carry on as if I knew nothing? Carry on living a miserable lie? I couldn't. Anyway, what about Mike? He knew something, that was for sure, but it appeared he had the wrong end of the stick. I would certainly see my son Mike in a different light from then on, but would I love Linda and Tom any less? I couldn't imagine that I would. How could I? They were my children, whether it was my sperm that created them or not, and no little piece of paper was going to change that. What about Hilly? Now that was a question. What about the bitch? And my bastard of a brother for that matter? And Pam, my sister-in-law, what about her? How would she take the news? How would the rest of the family take the news? Too many questions left my mind spinning. Oh God, this was all so complicated, and I didn't feel up to the challenge. I remember going out of the front door and starting to walk down the street, but the next thing I could recall was waking up in hospital, with bandages all over my arms. I've fallen in front of a car while piss-blind drunk, but I didn't know that at the time. Davy, are you okay? I looked round to see who had asked the question, but it hurt. It hurt like hell. Recognition dawned and I realized it was my ex-wife talking to me. No, not yet anyway. She was still my wife. I didn't say anything, or at least anything significant, just didn't know what to say. How about, honey, just discovered 2 of the kids are not mine, and that you've been fucking my brother. Have you had a nice day? What's for dinner? Just doesn't sound quite right, does it? In any case, turned out that my injuries were far from life-threatening, and the next day they sent me home. Couldn't do all that much to help myself though, so I bided my time while I had to rely on Hilly to minister to me. Give me time to think, time to play in. Waste of time though, and I still didn't know what to do, but somehow Mike and the other 2 kids seemed to be the central issue here. Whatever I decided, it had to look after their interests, even if mine had to suffer. From then on, Hilly's interests would come a poor last. All I did know was that our 20th wedding anniversary was looming, and the room was booked for our big dinner. It would have to be sorted by then. Within a week or so I was more or less back to normal, at least physically, and everything seemed to return to the way it had been, while I thought out what to do. Except for Mike, that is, and he seemed in danger of going off the rails, and was just the right age to do it. You'll have to speak to him, Davy, Hilly said late one evening. I don't know what's wrong with him. He just doesn't seem to want to speak to me anymore. I'll talk to him, I promised. Any idea what's wrong with him? She questioned me. I've got some ideas, I replied shortly. Want to discuss them with me, Davy? Not really, I replied, which brought her up short. The opportunity arose the very next day, when I caught him on his own in his room, and short of pushing me out of the way, he had way to avoid me. Want to talk about what's bothering you, son? I started gently. He just shook his head. Didn't want to talk? Would it be anything with the other day, Mike? I urged him. About our relationship. Mike looked up at me and I couldn't but help notice the tear in his eye. Suddenly he looked more than his tender years. You don't know Dad, do you? He challenged me. I might know more than you think, son, I countered him, trying to retain the smile on my face. Then why don't you do something about it, Dad, he whined. Why do you let them get away with it? Hang on. This wasn't going the way I thought it would. It didn't sound as if we were talking about the same bloody thing. Get away with what, son? What the hell else could I say? You really don't know, do you, Dad? He repeated. Apparently not, son. I had to admit. It's Mum and Uncle Tim, Dad. He told me in not much more than a whisper. When you're at work, once a month or so. It's so damn embarrassing. Uncle Tim. Bugger me. Tim was his husband, another of Hilly's damn sisters. Oh, that. I muttered pathetically, at a loss for anything else to say. They've been at it for years, Dad. My offspring informed me further. Linda reckons that I'm Tim's son and not yours. With that he broke down and cried, and I wrapped my arms round him to comfort him. It had been a long time since I'd done that, and it surprised me quite how big and strong my little boy felt. I can absolutely guarantee you, Mike, I consoled him as I continued to hold him. You are my son in every way, and not Tim's. How do you know, Dad? He sobbed. How can you be sure? I'm sure, son, I told him confidently. Believe me, I'm sure. We chatted away for some time, and without giving too much away, I convinced him of his parenthood, and it was like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. There was, however, no mention of my brother being the other two's father, and I discovered that my perfect family were not all so happy and contented as I believed. Both Linda and Tom knew of their mother's dalliance with their uncle, but not knowing what to do about it, chose to simply turn a blind eye. What an awful position to put your own children in. But Tim, Christ, his wife, and was the youngest of the 4 sisters, and without doubt the prettiest of the bunch by far. Hilly was attractive enough, and yet another spike was struck at the heart of my so-called perfect marriage to Hilly. A few days later, I took all 3 kids out for lunch, and did the most difficult thing I'd ever done in my life. I told them everything that I'd found out. The whole damn lot. I had no idea how they would react, but they took it well, all things considered. Linda cried a little and Tom sat there with his head in his hands. All 3 of them wanted to go and confront their mother straight away, but I persuaded them to wait, as I had things to sort out first. All 3 of them swore their love and devotion to me, and were not far from refusing to ever see Hilly again. I talked them out of that, of course, reminding them that whatever she'd done, she was still their mother and had cared wonderfully for them their whole lives. I spoke of her in terms that I didn't really feel, especially when the kids told me their story. Hilly, my loving wife, had apparently been having some sort of relationship with her brother-in-law, Tim, for some time, but in reality probably not really long enough to have been Mike's father. The once a month could have been a big exaggeration as well, but to be honest, none of us really knew. The one thing that I did know was that the kids were just so grateful to get it all off their chests, and all 3 of them cried, yes, even Tom, as we huddled together at the end of the evening. I'll correct that final statement, all 4 of us cried. Revenge. I needed revenge, but I needed it in a way that wouldn't cause grief to my children. And yes, I use the term advisedly, I did mean my children. I fought long and hard, but couldn't come up with any spectacular act of revenge. It would just have to be a straightforward confrontation. At least I had the event coming up when I could do that. The 10th of December. The family had gathered, as families do. My parents had both passed away by then, Bob and I being fairly late on children. There were 39 of us that sat down at the celebration dinner that night, mainly Hilly's side of the family and their families, but with a good sprinkling of other friends of both of us. The meal was good. At least that's what they told me. As for me, I could have been eating cardboard and drinking dishwater. Time for the speeches. Here we go. The end? Maybe the beginning. I was sweating profusely and taking long deep breaths to settle myself down. What I had to do wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. Welcome all our family and friends, I began, and went on for a few moments about inconsequential things. Now to celebrate 20 years of marriage to my wife Hilly, I eventually arrived at. There are a number of very interesting and even intimate and personal things about my marriage to my darling wife that I want to tell you all about. There was some chuckling round the large table, and one or two ribald comments about our presumed sex life. Hilly blushed. They all assumed I was joking, but how wrong could they have been? As the laughter died down, first Linda got up from her seat and made to leave the dining room, closely followed by Tom and then Mike. They never said a word to anyone, and the entire table watched their backs in astonishment, at a loss to what was happening. "Come back here, you free," cried out Hilly angrily, leaping to her feet. "Don't be so rude to your father." Only Tom responded, turning back to look at his mother for a moment and shaking his head unhappily, before joining his brother and sister outside. "Davy," shouted my wife to me, "do something. Tell them to come back immediately." "It's okay, honey," I told her very firmly. "They already know what I'm going to say, and since it concerns the three of them, maybe it would be better if they weren't here." Hilly's mouth dropped open in astonishment. Firstly in surprise at the manner in which I'd responded to her demand, and then worry taking over, as her mind must have ran through all the possible reasons for my attitude. "Sit down, Hilly," I told her, my tone leaving her in no doubt that I wasn't to be messed with. As I was saying, I continued looking at the people around me. I've had 20 wonderful years of marriage, the perfect marriage, or so I thought till a couple of weeks ago. I paused for effect, the atmosphere around the table electric. Some were looking bewildered, others still smiling waiting for the joke, but several of them very worried, including a few that surprised me. Imagine my surprise. I continued when nobody said anything. To find out that Linda, my beloved Linda, is not actually my own daughter. "Oh God," sobbed Hilly quietly, covering her face with her hands, the only one to make a sound. "Would you care to tell everyone who Linda's real father is, Hilly?" I asked her, but she remained silent except for her loud sobs, the only sound spoiling the complete and utter silence around me. "Okay then," I went on. "Anyone else care to tell everyone who Linda's father is? Anyone else care to tell everyone who's been fucking my wife behind my back?" Nobody spoke, and I just stood there, my angry gaze surveying the family and friends around me. As awful as it was, in some weird way, I sort of got some strange pleasure from teasing the people who had been deceiving me. None of them knew quite how much I'd found out. I couldn't help but give my brother Bob a particularly severe stare, and he visibly wilted under my gaze, knowing the game was up. "Nobody going to own up then?" I questioned them. "Have I got to tell everyone who it is?" Then came my surprise, and it was a surprise, as Bob's wife Pam leapt to her feet. "It's not what you think, Davy," she cried out in anguish. "It wasn't a sordid affair or anything. It was just sex a few times to get Hilly pregnant. The whole family were desperate for a boy in the family, especially mother, and it didn't look as if you were capable of fathering a child. Fortunately at that point, nobody actually hit me with the proverbial feather, otherwise for sure I would have been knocked down, as sure as eggs is eggs. She knew. She bloody well knew. Pam knew about her husband, my brother, fathering my daughter. I looked round the table and saw that it split into two camps. Friends who didn't know, and family, who for the most part seemed to. Even as I stood there trying to regain my senses, the friends, one by one, stood up, made their excuses and left in embarrassment, leaving 17 or 18 of us, all family. "Off you go and play over there," said Julie, one of Hilly's other sisters, and one by one the younger children were packed off out of the way. The teenagers were encouraged to disappear as well, but it must have been like EastEnders, Coronation Street, and Neighbors all rolled into one, and not one of them would be botched. "Fair enough. You all fucking well know, don't you?" I exclaimed, looking round. "You all know about this bloody fiasco except maybe the kids there." A couple of the husbands looked a bit blank, but otherwise nobody denied it. "Look, Davy," my brother stated to say, "it's not what it looks like, honestly." He wanted to add some other stupid comment, but my look of sheer hate at him shut him up dead. "So you all knew that Bob had sex with my loving wife, and Father Linda then?" I demanded of the table. Nobody said yes, but again, nobody denied it. "It was only 3 times, Davy," piped up Pam again. just enough to get her pregnant. Whose damn idea was this in the first place? I shouted aloud at them, my temper beginning to flare. Again, nobody said anything, but simply too many glances were directed at Jan, my mother-in-law. I might have guessed it. Thanks, Mom, I said to her solemnly. Your desperation for a son in the family has cost me my marriage. No, cried out Hilly, at last deciding to take part. Please don't say that, Davy. You can't mean it. I couldn't live without you. Surely you can forgive me just one mistake. One mistake? I asked her. Just one mistake? Of course, honey, Hilly sobbed at me. It was just that one time. It seems terrible now, but when Mom planned it all out all those years ago, it seemed to make sense. What about Tom then? Well, he's yours of course, Davy, she whined. What do you mean? Wrong. I informed her. I've had DNA testing done, and his father is the same man as Linda's. The atmosphere around the table changed immediately. What are you saying, Davy? Pam cried out in surprise. You heard me, Pam, I told her. If my ever-loving brother there is Linda's dad, then he fathered Tom as well. Silence. That piece of information was obviously new to the table, or at least to most of them. You bastard, Bob, Pam rounded on her husband as realization dawned. You promised me. You promised me, and then you went off fucking the bitch again. Bob just put his head down wishing he was somewhere else. And you bitch. Pam screamed at Hilly. I agreed to let you have my husband just that 1 week, and then you carry on fucking him. With that she took 3 steps towards her sister, and slapped Hilly mightily hard round the face. Bitch, poor, bleeding cow, she berated Hilly, hitting her yet again and again, only stopping and bursting into tears when one of the others pulled her off her younger sister. Happy, Mum, are you? I spat out at Jan, but all she did was stare back at me blankly. So who else has been screwing my wife behind my back then? I challenged them when nobody else spoke, looking across directly at Tim, who was sat on the other side of the table from me. You bastard, screamed Julie alongside me. Now that one caught me out as well. It's true what they told me that night, wasn't it, you bastard? You did fuck her that night at the party. Hello? What was going on here? Julie was screaming at her husband Ted, and he was looking sheepish, denying nothing. And you, my darling sister, she shouted at my wife. Have you fucked all your brother-in-laws, you bloody whore? Well, she's certainly done Tim over there. I threw in heartily, really beginning to enjoy the whole show. Me. What? I haven't. That is. Tim didn't even lie very well, nor was he very agile that night, completely failing to dodge his wife, In's fist, as she clocked him one slap bang on the nose. Don't come back to our house tonight, and screamed at her husband. In fact, don't ever come back. That goes for you as well, Pam spat out at Bob. I'm divorcing you and never want to see you again. The 3 aggrieved sisters linked arms and made for the door. You're no sister of ours, they shouted back at Hilly as they stormed out. Happy now, Chan? I asked my mother-in-law, but her expression never changed as she sat there staring straight ahead, while Hilly continued to sob into her arms. Sorry, Davy, Alf, my father-in-law broke in at last. If I had known. He broke off, lost for words, but was the only one of the turds who'd made any effort to apologize. Then Brother Bob came round the table towards me, holding his hands out, a look of utter shame on his face. Davy, he coughed out. Davy, what can I say? Nothing, you bastard, I spat back at him, and with no real force behind it, I swung at him and caught my brother right on the point of his chin. Not much force maybe, but the timing was perfect, and he staggered back till he tripped over a chair and went sprawling on the floor, and made no rush to get up. I guess you could say that the party broke up about then. Seemed the fun had gone out of the whole evening. Hilly never came home that night, and in fact except for collecting a few things, she never came home again. The kids refused point blank to speak to her for some time afterwards, but hate her as I did, I had to think of the kids' long-time welfare. Eventually they came round and accepted her back into their lives, but never the same as before. I was dad, and she was. Well, I guess she became more like a favorite aunt of some sort. The whole family thing split apart, 2 of the 3 sisters who had walked out that night getting divorces, only Pam staying with Bob, though she gave him a hell of a run around, deciding that what was good for the goose was good for the gander. Pam came round a couple of evenings later when the kids were out, and it rapidly became apparent what she had in mind. Whether it was revenge for her, or to give me some payback, I never found out, but payback I got. There was no love, no compassion, and we just screwed like rabbits for several hours. It was strange, just like having sex with my wife, but different. She thanked me afterwards and left, and I only discovered some months later that she'd made a habit of it, slowly working through Bob's mates till she'd bedded just about all of them. Would their marriage survive? No idea, and I didn't care, not my problem, but it must be bloody miserable for that damn brother of mine. 3 weeks later, one of the other sisters, and the pretty one, phoned me and invited me out to dinner. I went, we eat, we talked, we romanced, we kissed, and ended up in bed. But this time it was different, and after the first passions, we made love, and it was like my early days with Hilly again. No idea why Tim had strayed from his marriage, but it certainly wasn't anything to do with N's appetite for sex. The sweetest pill maybe was when Jan, my ex-mother-in-law's long-suffering husband Alf, decided he'd had enough of her interfering, bought a 40-foot yacht, and spent the rest of his active life sailing throughout Europe. Came in handy. Me, and sometimes the kids would spend a week or two sailing with him, and places like the south of France, La Rochelle and the Canaries became familiar to us. Linda met and eventually married a young Spaniard who she met when sailing, and whose family owned what was maybe the biggest boat marina in Europe. That came in handy as well. The two boys are still playing the field, maybe warned off of marrying too early like their father had. They had time. And me. I don't see Hilly, but the kids tell me she is living life day by day, and asks after me frequently. The kids tell me and I just grunt. Oh, and I'm thinking of trying out for that perfect marriage again, but this time within. I think we love one another, but we are both still a little wary. We'll say. I want to be sure I'm not marrying and partly despite Hilly, but I'd love to see her face if I did. Dear listener, if you have reached this far, please click on the subscribe button. It will be a great help.